They had expected chains, curses, and a starvation fit for enemies. Instead, they were handed bowls where pale scoops of ice shimmered under the sun, cold against the tongue, melting into sweetness that seemed impossible in the shadow of war. Welcome, traveler of memory. Tell me, where and when do you listen tonight? Share your place, your hour, so we may weave a net of time across the earth together. And if this vault of scandal and remembrance is of value to you, press the mark of subscription, so our wandering tales may continue their journey beside you. The first sight of ice cream came not with ceremony, but with casualness, as though it were the most ordinary of offerings. A guard moved down the line, his steps unhurried, his face unreadable, carrying tubs of frozen white. The prisoners, men once schooled to believe that to be captured was the ultimate shame, stared in silence. They had braced themselves for blows, for mocking laughter, perhaps even for the deprivation that was considered a natural fate of the defeated. Instead, they were met with this small miracle, a sweetness in place of bitterness, a coolness in the heat of their despair. The wooden spoons scraped gently against the surface, and many held them still, unsure if this was a trick, or if they were meant to eat. Some touched the ice to their lips and flinched at the shock of cold. Others gazed at their captors, searching for meaning in the gesture, uncertain of whether this food was nourishment or insult. Was it pity, or was it power, to feed an enemy so kindly? For the Japanese soldier, brought up in an empire where suffering was glorified and surrender condemned, such an act unsettled the core of belief. The spirit of Bushido, the code of honor, had long declared that captivity was a stain that could never be cleansed. Propaganda had taught them that the Americans were barbarians, devoid of civility, eager to destroy, humiliate, and degrade. Yet here they were, standing in the sun, eating what in their homeland had been a rare luxury even in times of peace. To taste such sweetness was to touch contradiction. The taste of sugar lingered on the tongue, soft and dissolving, bringing with it memories of festivals, of childhood, of fleeting moments before war consumed everything. It was as though the past itself had been smuggled into the camp. And so, in silence, men who had prepared to die with honor instead lived with confusion. They had believed that to be a prisoner was to be stripped of dignity, yet in this simple act of being fed like a guest rather than tormented like a captive, the borders of expectation blurred. Perhaps it is worth asking, what does sweetness mean when one is meant to suffer? Can kindness wound more deeply than cruelty when it forces the captive to doubt all he thought was true? For some, the ice cream was not only a gift, but a burden. To eat was to admit that the enemy could be merciful, that the lessons of home had been shaped in shadows and illusions. To refuse was to hunger, yet to accept was to yield to uncertainty. And so, each spoonful was not simply food, but a negotiation between loyalty and survival, between pride and the undeniable truth of hunger. The camp itself lay quiet around them, with wooden barracks casting long shadows and the faint hum of flies thick in the summer air. Beyond the barbed wire, trees swayed gently, indifferent to the struggles of men. Inside, however, the prisoners carried storms that no one could see. Some lowered their eyes, hiding the glimmer of moisture that threatened to betray them, not from the cold of the ice, but from the collapse of certainty. Others ate quickly, as though fearing it might be taken away, as though the enemy's generosity could vanish at any moment like the melting cream itself. How fragile the human mind becomes when its pillars are shaken. A soldier once ready to thrust a bayonet into the heart of an invader now paused over a bowl of dessert, torn between gratitude and shame. In this way, the war entered another field, not of gunfire and explosions, but of taste and perception, of symbols hidden in ordinary things. One may wonder if the guards understood what they were giving, or if to them it was nothing but surplus, a casual distribution of supplies that meant little beyond routine. Perhaps to the Americans, it was an unremarkable act, another form of humane treatment that cost little effort. Yet to the Japanese prisoners, it was a revelation, heavy with meaning, unshakable in memory. In that frozen sweetness lay not only comfort, but contradiction, the realization that an enemy may not resemble the demon painted in propaganda, and that captivity could be stranger than imagined. And still, the ice melted. Drops ran down the sides of bowls, soaking into wood, dripping unnoticed to the earth. Some prisoners licked every trace, unwilling to let any part of it escape. Others set the spoons aside, unable to reconcile the act with their conscience. In that small courtyard of the camp, silence hung heavier than noise. It is said that the first taste of ice cream for these men was remembered long after the war ended, carried in recollections more vivid than battles. For in that moment, sweetness and defeat collided, and neither could be separated from the other. War had taught them to expect darkness, but here was light in unexpected form. And does not light, when it comes suddenly, blind before it soothes? The image remains, a prisoner holding a spoon, uncertain, the surface of the ice shimmering, a drop sliding off and falling into the dust below, vanishing as though it had never been. The drip of melting ice slipped into the earth, unseen, leaving behind a faint mark that faded as quickly as it appeared. It was a small vanishing, an ordinary thing, yet for those who stood watching the bowl in their hands, it was as if the very essence of their expectations had seeped away with it. The taste of cold cream lingered on the tongue, but the meaning lingered far longer in the mind. They had been trained to imagine the enemy as a creature without mercy, to believe that capture was worse than death, that captivity would bring only humiliation. Yet here was a sweetness offered without condition, given not as poison but as nourishment, leaving them in quiet disbelief. In the drip, in the melting, a boundary dissolved, and with it, an entire structure of thought began to soften like the cream itself. The cicadas sang beyond the camp walls, their endless drone filling the summer air. That sound was familiar, for it was the same chorus they had known in their homeland, the song of long evenings when the sun dipped low and the air held both warmth and sorrow. But now, against the backdrop of captivity, the cicadas sounded strange. They seemed to blur the line between Japan and America, between memory and present. The men listened, perhaps without meaning to, and wondered how something so constant could follow them into a place of such contradiction. Cicadas did not know war, nor surrender, nor shame. They simply sang, as they always had. It was this constancy of nature, indifferent to the fates of men, that pressed against the walls of their beliefs. In Japan, they had been taught that to be captured alive was the gravest dishonor. The warrior was meant to die for the emperor, to embrace death as proof of loyalty. Yet here they were, living, breathing, eating. They did not face cruelty in every moment. Instead, they faced confusion. How could they reconcile the teachings of their homeland with the reality that unfolded before them? Was it weakness to accept kindness from the enemy, or was it strength to survive and bear witness? The clash between belief and experience was sharper than any weapon. When a soldier is told that the enemy is a beast, every act of humanity from that enemy becomes unbearable. It forces the captive to question not only the foe, but the world he left behind. Perhaps this is why the ice cream carried such weight, though it was only a simple dessert. It stood as proof that what they had been told was not the full truth. And to accept that was not easy, for it meant acknowledging that their leaders had shaped illusions, that suffering and endurance were not the only paths left to them. Some men embraced this contradiction quietly, eating every spoonful with the secret gratitude of those who have known hunger. Others resisted, holding to the belief that to accept kindness was itself a form of defeat. And still, the ice melted, and the cicadas sang, as if mocking the struggles within the hearts of men. The camp was not a place of comfort, yet it was not the imagined hell. Barbed wire stood high, and guards walked their posts with rifles slung at their sides, but daily life was ordered and strangely humane. There were routines, meals at set times, labor in measured amounts, and the occasional unexpected gift, like the day of the ice cream. To the Japanese prisoners, this structure was at once soothing and unsettling. It was not the brutal punishment they had envisioned, but neither was it freedom. It was a liminal space, caught between worlds, neither battlefield nor home, neither torment nor peace. In such a place, the mind wandered to questions that had no answers. What was honor here? Was it in dying bravely, as they had once been told, or in enduring captivity with dignity, even if it meant facing the disapproval of those far away? And if honor shifted, like the sound of cicadas carried on the wind, what did that say about truth itself? There were evenings when men sat quietly outside their barracks, watching the last light fade beyond the wire. They would think of home, of families they could not reach, of voices they would not hear. In those hours, the memory of ice cream returned, like a dream that seemed too strange to retell. Could they ever confess to their families that they had been given such sweetness by the enemy? Would it not sound like betrayal? Or worse, like an invention? Better, perhaps, to keep silent, to carry the memory as a private burden, unshared and unspoken. The cicadas droned on, unending, filling the silence with their chorus. In that sound lay the reminder that the world beyond the camp continued, that the seasons moved, that time did not stop for the captured. And yet, inside the wire, the men felt as though time had thickened, slowed, become heavy. Each day was both endless and fleeting, marked by small details that became enormous in memory: the taste of sugar, the glint of sunlight on a guard's belt, the sound of distant trains. Perhaps it is this weight of small things that makes captivity so difficult to grasp. In war, moments are sharp, clear, defined by violence and fear. But in captivity, moments blur, softened by routine and punctured by surprises that challenge belief. The prisoners lived in that blur, their sense of self shifting with each passing day. They had entered as soldiers, yet they became something else, neither warriors nor civilians, but shadows waiting for an end they could not predict. As the cicadas continued their endless song, the men lay down to rest, carrying with them the memory of melting ice and the confusion it had left behind. And in the stillness of the night, broken only by the soft crunch of a guard's footsteps on gravel, they wondered silently what would remain of them when the war itself was done. The crunch of footsteps on gravel echoed softly in the night air, steady, measured, each sound falling like a pebble into the silence of the camp. The men lying awake within the wooden barracks could hear it, faint yet inescapable, a rhythm that reminded them of the vigilance of their captors. To some it was a comfort, the sign of order and predictability. To others, it was a reminder that freedom was now a memory, just beyond the wire, guarded by boots and rifles. The footsteps seemed endless, circling the perimeter as though time itself had taken on a sound, round and round, never resting. And as those sounds faded and returned, the prisoners were drawn back to the lessons of their homeland, to the voices of commanders and teachers who had filled their ears with a single truth: that the enemy was merciless, a demon clad in human skin, a being incapable of compassion. Yet these footsteps belonged to men who had offered ice cream, who had handed out cigarettes, who had spoken not with snarls, but with ordinary words. The contradiction burned within. How could it be that those who had been called beasts walked like any man, smoked like any man, and even laughed in moments of idleness? Propaganda had taught the Japanese soldiers to expect torture, to expect cruelty that would strip away their humanity. The reality was bewildering. They had not been starved to death, nor beaten for sport, nor paraded in mockery. They had been guarded, yes, and confined, but also given meals, medical care, even gestures of kindness. It was difficult for them to admit this truth, even to themselves. The pride of their culture, steeped in the belief that to die for the emperor was the highest glory, resisted such acknowledgement. To confess that the enemy could be humane was to open the door to a greater, more painful realization that perhaps they themselves had been misled, that their leaders had built the scaffolding of loyalty on illusions. How can a man bear such doubt when everything he has lived for has been framed in certainty? Still, doubt entered, as steady as the footsteps on gravel. A guard's whistle at dawn, a loaf of bread divided evenly, a scoop of ice cream in summer. Each detail lodged itself into the mind and refused to depart. One could silence it in the day, but at night, when the cicadas fell quiet and the camp settled into stillness, those memories rose like ghosts. Some men turned on their mats, trying to shut out the questions that came, but others stared into the darkness, listening to the steps outside, wondering whether the voices they had once trusted had spoken truth or lies. In that darkness, imagination replayed the stories told back home. Posters had depicted Americans as wild-eyed brutes, descending with flames and claws. Films had shown them as savages who trampled the weak. Mothers warned their children that if captured, they would be torn apart without mercy. How strange, then, to lie in a barrack where the greatest noise was the sound of boots on gravel, and the greatest cruelty was the monotony of captivity. Was it possible, they asked in secret, that the enemy was not as monstrous as they had believed? And if so, then what of all the sacrifices, all the deaths, all the unyielding loyalty demanded in the name of the emperor? The silence between the prisoners grew heavy. Few dared to voice such thoughts aloud, for fear of being branded weak, or worse, traitorous to the very spirit that bound them. Yet silence itself carried weight. In a glance, in the hesitation before speaking, in the way one lingered over the last bite of a meal, truths were exchanged without words. A man who savored his bread too slowly, who licked the last trace of ice cream from the edge of a spoon, revealed something that words could never safely carry: that he was grateful, that he was bewildered, that he no longer knew what to believe. The footsteps continued outside, drawing a circle around the camp. To the guards, it was routine. To the prisoners, it was the sound of a world that made less and less sense. For in each step, there was order without cruelty, control without rage, confinement without the lash of the whip. The dissonance grew louder than the cicadas, louder than the night air itself. Perhaps the most painful realization was not that they had been deceived, but that their enemy had been ordinary all along. Ordinary men in ordinary uniforms who laughed and smoked and shared food. To realize this was to see war itself as a kind of madness. For how could such ordinary men be the devils they were told to resist to the death? And if the enemy was ordinary, what then of themselves? Were they not also ordinary, trapped in uniforms, carrying rifles, obeying commands spun from fear and pride? These questions turned like restless birds within the mind, fluttering without rest. There was no answer that could soothe them, for to find an answer would require breaking faith with everything they had sworn to uphold. So the questions remained unresolved, echoing with every crunch of the guards' boots on gravel. And when morning came, the sun would rise over a camp that seemed unchanged, the barbed wire still sharp, the sentries still watchful. Yet inside the prisoners' hearts, something subtle had shifted. Belief, once as rigid as steel, had begun to bend, softened by the simple, quiet humanity of their captors. The night deepened. Footsteps faded into distance, and silence returned, heavy and absolute. Yet within that silence, questions grew, unresolved, unspoken, echoing into the endless dark. The footsteps on gravel faded, leaving only the stillness of dawn. As the sky grew pale with the first light of morning, the camp stirred to life in quiet routine. The barracks creaked as men rose from their thin bedding, their movements heavy, not from violence, but from weariness, from the endless repetition of days that seemed to blur together. Outside, the smell of damp earth mingled with the faint smoke of the kitchen fires, and soon the prisoners lined up, bowls in hand, awaiting their portion of food. There was little grandeur in this act, nothing dramatic, yet in the scraping of spoons against metal, in the small cloud of steam that rose from a pot, life continued in captivity. It was here, in the smallest of details, that the strangeness of their existence revealed itself. The routine of the camp did not match the nightmare they had been taught to expect. There were rules, certainly, and punishments for disobedience, but there was also rhythm, structure, and the possibility of nourishment. Bread, potatoes, stew, sometimes meat, and on rare days, the sweetness of ice cream. It was not feasting, but it was survival, and more than some had imagined. For men who had expected starvation, who had braced themselves for cruelty, even an ordinary meal carried weight. The scent of food, the texture of it, the warmth filling the stomach. It was as though the ordinary itself had become extraordinary. One prisoner, seated on the ground with his bowl, paused in the act of eating and looked around at his companions. Their faces were thin, their uniforms worn, but their hands moved steadily, lifting spoons, tearing bread, chewing slowly as though to prolong the act. The sound of many men eating together filled the air, not noisy, but persistent. The clink of metal against tin, the faint slurp of broth. It was a sound that reminded them they were still alive, and in that reminder came both comfort and unease. To live as a prisoner was not what they had been prepared for. Each bite was proof of survival, but also a reminder of shame, for survival meant they had not chosen death when capture came. The scrape of spoons against bowls became a constant refrain, rising and falling like the cicadas outside. And in that sound lay the heart of captivity. Not pain, not cruelty, but the quiet persistence of existence in a place that was meant to break them. In each scoop and swallow, they were forced to confront what it meant to endure. For the Japanese soldier, honor was not meant to be preserved through such means. Honor had been painted in the image of the dying warrior, sword in hand, unyielding in the face of the enemy. Yet here, honor took on a quieter shape, less dramatic, harder to define. Was it dishonor to accept food from the enemy? Was it dishonor to sleep in their barracks, to walk within their fences, to rise and sleep at the sound of their whistles? Or was there a form of dignity in enduring, in surviving what had been thought unbearable, in holding fast to oneself even within confinement? These questions lingered in every motion, unspoken yet inescapable. The routine of the camp pressed these questions into the men day after day. There was work to be done, fields to tend, repairs to complete, sometimes labor that felt meaningless, yet never the cruelty of deliberate torment. The guards watched, but they did not always sneer. They gave commands, but they also gave food. Their presence was a shadow, but not the monstrous specter painted in stories. And so the prisoners lived in the strangeness of a reality that did not align with belief, a place where survival was possible, even offered. Yet pride was tested in ways more subtle than battle. The scrape of a spoon against an empty bowl carried its own echo, hollow and unresolved. It spoke of hunger that never fully left, of satisfaction that was never quite complete. The men would lick the edges of their bowls, chasing the last drops of broth, the last grains of rice, the last trace of sweetness. It was not desperation alone, it was reverence for sustenance, for the fragile thread that bound them to life. Each empty bowl was a mirror of their condition, filled for a moment, emptied, waiting again for what the next day might bring. In the afternoons, when work was done and the sun hung heavy above, some men would sit quietly, their backs against the barrack walls, staring at nothing. Their thoughts wandered to the homes they had left, to the families who did not know whether they were alive or dead. Some dreamed of the food of their childhood, fish grilled over coals, rice steaming from the pot, pickled vegetables with sharp flavors. Against such memories, the camp meals seemed both kind and cruel, enough to sustain but never to satisfy. The scrape of spoons brought comfort, yet also reminded them of what was lost, of what could not be regained in captivity. There were those who found strength in silence, who ate without a word, who carried themselves with a calm that others envied. Perhaps they believed that dignity could be preserved in bearing hardship without complaint. Perhaps they simply had no words left. But in their stillness, they gave shape to an idea that honor might yet be found not in dying, but in living without surrendering the core of oneself. And yet, the questions never faded. Was it weakness to eat, to sleep, to accept the rhythms given by the enemy? Was it cowardice to endure when others had chosen to fall on their swords or charge into hopeless battles? Or was it, perhaps, another kind of courage, one that did not match the stories of heroes, but belonged to the ordinary, to those who endured day after day in a place where certainty had melted away like ice in the sun? The evening came again, shadows stretching across the camp, the air cooling as the cicadas quieted. The men returned their bowls, the scrape of spoons now replaced by the scrape of footsteps as they moved back to their barracks. The day ended much as it had begun, with routine, with silence, with the strange blend of survival and shame that captivity brought. And when the lamps dimmed, and the camp settled into darkness once more, the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a tin bowl lingered in memory, faint but unyielding, like a question that could not yet be answered. The scraping of the spoon against the tin bowl lingered like a faint echo in the ear, a hollow sound that spoke of hunger not entirely soothed. That sound, sharp and metallic, carried the mind far beyond the camp's wire fences, across oceans, back to the homeland where hunger had long been a constant companion. For many prisoners, the scrape was a summons to memory, of empty cupboards, of rice stretched thin with barley, of children licking bowls clean, not because they were greedy, but because there was nothing more to eat. The memory rose unbidden, sharper than the taste of any food in the camp, more piercing than the guard's whistle. Hunger at home had not been an accident of captivity. It had been the air itself, woven into daily life as the war consumed everything. In the cities of Japan, the once bustling markets had grown quieter, their stalls thinner, their baskets lighter. Women stood in long lines with ration tickets clutched tightly, hoping for rice, often receiving substitutes, millet, potatoes, even flour mixed with sawdust when shortages grew most severe. Children carried metal tins to soup kitchens, waiting for ladles of thin broth that smelled more of water than of nourishment. For the soldiers now held as prisoners, these memories pressed upon them each time they ate. To have food, even under captivity, was both blessing and torment, for they knew that those they loved had far less. One man recalled his mother's face, lined with worry, her hands raw from washing clothes that never seemed to dry in the damp air of rationing years. He thought of the meals she had prepared with care, bowls of rice shared between many mouths, fish bones boiled to extract the last drop of flavor. Another remembered the wide eyes of his younger sister, who had once stared at a single sweet bun in a bakery window as though it were a treasure beyond reach. For them, hunger had been not a punishment from enemies, but the natural weight of war on the homeland. The scrape of spoons in camp seemed to join with the scrape of chopsticks on empty bowls back home, two sounds woven together by absence. In captivity, the men were fed regularly, if modestly. In Japan, their families scraped and saved, often going without. The contradiction lay heavy in the heart: to be defeated and imprisoned, yet nourished; to be free at home, yet starved. Which, then, was the greater cruelty? In quiet hours, when no guard watched closely, men spoke of these memories in whispers. They told of rice fields that no longer yielded enough, of factories bombed until food could not be transported, of mothers trading heirlooms for sacks of millet. One man described the thin rice gruel his unit had eaten before surrender. So weak it ran like water across the bowl, leaving bellies aching even after it was gone. Another remembered the festival days of childhood, when shaved ice with syrup had seemed a marvel, a luxury shared in laughter, now replaced by the bitter absence of sweets. Against such recollections, the ice cream in the American camp burned more brightly in memory, not only for its taste, but for the reminder that abundance still existed somewhere, even as their homeland withered. Was this abundance mercy, or was it mockery? The prisoners asked themselves this silently, never aloud. To be fed in captivity while imagining loved ones starving brought not peace, but unease. Each bite carried guilt as well as relief. Did their mothers eat that day? Did their fathers work fields with empty stomachs? Did their children, if they had them, cry from hunger in the night? The scrape of a spoon in the camp became the sound of absence back home, a reminder of the great gulf that war had opened between soldier and family. There were nights when a prisoner lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above, and thought of what might arrive in a letter, if one could come. Would his wife write of scarcity, of meals missed, of neighbors gone thin with want? Would she confess to selling belongings to buy rice, or would she hide her suffering to protect him, just as he hid his small comforts from her? Yet the letters rarely came, and when they did, they were censored, stripped of truth. Silence became the more common companion, and silence is heavier than hunger. The scrape of the spoon carried all these thoughts. It was not only the sound of the camp, but the sound of memory itself, an unyielding reminder that the hunger of war stretched far beyond the fences. And so, with each meal, the men bore not only their own survival, but the weight of those who starved unseen. One prisoner, holding his empty bowl, closed his eyes and imagined he was at home, his family seated on the tatami floor, sharing what little they had. He imagined his mother's voice urging him to eat, though she herself took nothing. He imagined the warmth of the hearth, the crackle of kindling, the smell of rice steaming, faint but enough to soothe the heart. Then the image faded, and the camp returned, the barracks, the guards, the endless fence. Yet the sound of scraping lingered, and with it the ache of hunger, both present and remembered. Perhaps this is why the ice cream stood apart in memory. It was not only sweetness, but abundance made visible, a thing their families could not touch, a symbol of a world beyond deprivation. To taste it was to glimpse what had been lost at home, and the contrast was unbearable. In the homeland, children dreamed of bread, of sweets, of fullness. In captivity, soldiers touched that dream with their spoons, only to feel the bitterness of knowing they could not share it. And so, the scrape of the spoon at the bottom of a tin bowl was more than noise. It was a confession of survival, a whisper of guilt, a bridge of memory that tied the camp to the starving homeland. Each man carried it differently, some in silence, some in whispered recollections, some in dreams that woke them with wet eyes. Hunger had shaped them before, and hunger shaped them still. Not the hunger of the belly alone, but the hunger for truth, for connection, for the chance to reconcile the contradictions of their fate. The scrape echoed on, fading into silence, leaving the image of a letter unsent, words never written, truths never shared. The image of the unsent letter lingered in the air, as if a phantom hand still held the brush above the page, ink trembling but never falling. Within the camp, paper was scarce, and words scarcer still. A prisoner might find himself sitting before a blank sheet, permitted to write a few lines under the strict eyes of his captors, yet what could be written? The letter that left his hand would be opened, inspected, censored, stripped of its truth before it ever crossed the ocean. How, then, could he pour the weight of his captivity, his confusion, his strange moments of sweetness and shame into a page that could not bear them? The letter remained unwritten, a silence heavier than any confession. He imagined beginning with the familiar greeting, the respectful words to a father, the tender ones to a mother, the restrained affection to a wife or child. But how could he tell them that he lived when so many did not? How could he describe the food he was given without betraying those at home who ate so little? Was it mercy to tell them that he was treated humanely, or was it betrayal to reveal that the enemy could be kinder than expected? The brush hovered, but no words came, and so the letter remained unsent, like countless others that lived only in the hearts of men, folded and sealed within silence. Some tried to write regardless. They bent their words into shapes that might pass the censor's eye, phrases carefully chosen, stripped of pain yet hinting at it in the spaces between. "I am well," they wrote, though their hearts trembled with uncertainty. "I think of you daily," though they knew the image of home was blurring with each passing season. "The days are long, but I endure," though what they wished to say was that each day was a labyrinth of doubt, where kindness and captivity mingled like oil and water. When these letters reached home, families held them close, read them until the paper softened, searching for hidden meanings in every stroke of the brush. But most letters never left at all, and the prisoners learned to live with the ache of words unsent. Ink itself became a symbol of futility. The act of writing, once a bridge between souls, turned into a hollow ritual. Some men pressed their brushes firmly, as though trying to carve their thoughts into permanence. Others allowed the ink to bleed, spreading across the page like sorrow that could not be contained. And sometimes, when paper ran short, they wrote in their minds alone, reciting letters silently in the darkness, as though the act of shaping the words inwardly might still reach across the sea. But silence remained the truest letter of all, an emptiness shared between prisoner and family, each side waiting, each side wondering, neither fully knowing. The unsent letter carried more than absence. It carried the impossibility of truth. What could truth mean in such a place? If a man wrote that he had eaten ice cream, who would believe him? If he wrote that the enemy fed him more generously than his own country had been able to in the final months of war, would his family understand? Or would they think he had been broken, his loyalty dissolved? If he wrote that he felt guilt for surviving, guilt for eating when others starved, what comfort could that bring to those who waited at home? The truth, heavy and strange, could not survive on paper. It could only live in the silence of the unsent letter. And so the prisoners walked the camp, carrying invisible scrolls within them, letters never written, conversations never spoken, memories preserved only in the heart. Each man had his own, a message to a mother, to a wife, to a child. Some messages were tender, filled with longing. Others were bitter, filled with shame, but all were unfinished, carried silently as though they were the very air of captivity. Sometimes, in the still hours of the night, when the camp lay quiet and only the faint buzz of insects filled the air, a man would whisper his letter aloud, as though the wind itself might carry it across the sea. These words vanished into the darkness, unheard. Yet in the speaking there was a small relief. It was as though he had unburdened himself to the night, even if no one answered. Yet even this fragile solace carried danger, for if another prisoner heard too much, if a guard caught the sound, the letter of the heart might become a chain of shame. And so most remained silent, carrying their words inside like stones. The image of ink bleeding on damp paper haunted them. Paper left in the humid night would warp, edges curling, letters blurring until the meaning dissolved into stains. So too did their thoughts blur in captivity, intentions smudging, clarity fading. What had once been firm beliefs grew faint, uncertain. Just as a letter soaked in rain lost its shape, so did their certainty about the war, about honor, about themselves. And yet, even blurred, even unsent, the letters of the heart remained. They were not destroyed, only hidden, carried like secret relics that would perhaps one day be spoken, or perhaps never. In time, the silence itself became a bond among the prisoners. They rarely spoke of their families, rarely dared to ask about one another's memories, yet each man knew the others carried letters unwritten. It was a shared burden, invisible yet heavy. And when they sat together, bowls in hand, spoons scraping, eyes downcast, it was as though the silence of unsent letters sat among them, another prisoner in their midst. The unsent letter remained, suspended in air, its ink never dry, its words never read. And as night fell once more, the faint sound of rain touched the roof of the barracks, each drop a mark upon the silence, like ink bleeding into paper. The blurred ink, spreading across damp paper until the words lost their shape, became the blurred boundary between friend and foe. In captivity, the prisoners learned that war's stark lines, enemy and ally, right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, were not as sharp as they had once believed. The Americans who guarded them were meant to be monsters, and yet at times their actions seemed almost gentle. A cigarette offered across the fence, a crust of bread shared when rations allowed, the unexpected shock of ice cream on a summer day. These gestures eroded the wall of hatred that propaganda had tried to cement. But if the enemy could show kindness, what then did that mean of the world they had known? It is one thing to be defeated by cruelty. It is another to be disarmed by mercy. For cruelty can be resisted, defied, even in silence. But kindness unsettles more deeply, striking not at the body, but at the foundation of belief. The men in the camp wrestled with this contradiction, each in his own quiet way. To accept a cigarette was to acknowledge a common humanity, to inhale not only smoke, but also the faint suggestion that captor and captive might, in another time, have been companions. To take a piece of bread was to share in the same nourishment, to let the enemy's generosity become part of one's own survival. And to taste ice cream was to be reminded that joy, sweetness, and abundance could flow even from the hands of those once hated. Yet this blurred boundary was not without unease. Some prisoners accepted the offerings with gratitude, hidden behind lowered eyes. Others refused, stiff with pride, unable to bear the thought of owing anything to the enemy. Still others took the gifts, but later turned them over in their minds with bitterness, as though to wonder whether such gestures were sincere or merely weapons of another kind, designed to soften and confuse. Was kindness itself a strategy of war? Could an enemy disarm not by sword or rifle, but by bread and sugar? These questions crept into the silence of the camp, heavier than the barbed wire that fenced them in. The smoke of a cigarette curled into the air one afternoon, its thin line rising lazily against the blue sky. A guard had passed it through the fence, and a prisoner, hesitant at first, had taken it. The match struck, the paper glowed, and the prisoner inhaled, feeling the burn in his throat, the familiar haze settle in his lungs. Around him, others watched, some with envy, some with reproach. The smoke drifted over them all, a shared presence whether they chose it or not. And in that moment, the boundary between guard and prisoner blurred. The cigarette carried no language, no uniform, no flag. It was simply smoke, and it bound them in its curling threads. Perhaps mercy itself is like smoke, difficult to grasp, impossible to hold, yet undeniable once breathed. The prisoners found themselves caught in this haze, uncertain whether to embrace it or resist it. For every act of kindness reminded them of the humanity of their captors, yet also reminded them of the distance between what they had believed and what they now saw. Could one still hate a man who shared his smoke? Could one despise a people who offered food not only to their own, but to those they had captured? These questions pressed upon them like a weight, for to answer was to risk unraveling the very fabric of their honor. And yet, honor itself seemed to waver. Once it had been defined by the refusal to surrender, by the willingness to die before capture. But here, where life continued under the care of the enemy, honor took on new, uncertain shapes. Was it honorable to reject kindness, to hold rigidly to the old definitions even if it meant suffering needlessly? Or was there a form of honor in accepting humanity where it was offered, in recognizing that even the enemy bore the same breath, the same hunger, the same fleeting joys. The line blurred, as ink blurred on damp paper, as smoke blurred the edges of sky. At night, some prisoners lay awake, replaying these gestures in their minds. A guard's brief smile, the shared warmth of bread, the laughter that sometimes drifted from the American side of the fence. These fragments intruded into dreams, softening the harsh lines of enmity. Yet with morning, the prisoners rose again to the routines of confinement, and the clarity of discipline returned. They bowed their heads, obeyed orders, spoke little. The blur was pushed aside, though never erased. What troubled them most was not the kindness itself, but what it revealed. If the Americans could be merciful, then the image painted by their homeland was incomplete. If the image was incomplete, then what of the sacrifices made in its name? What of the comrades who had died believing they faced a merciless foe? To admit that the enemy was capable of compassion was to admit that those deaths had been born on illusions, that the war itself had been shaped by shadows and half-truths. Such a realization was too heavy to carry, and so the prisoners bore it in silence, each man hiding his unease as carefully as he hid his letters unsent. Still, the gestures continued. Bread passed quietly, cigarettes shared, ice cream handed out as casually as if it were nothing. The boundaries blurred further with each act, until the prisoners no longer knew where hatred ended and humanity began. Was the guard who lit a cigarette for them still an enemy? Was the man who ladled soup into their bowls still a beast to be despised? Or were these men simply reflections of themselves, caught on the other side of a fence erected by war? The smoke of the cigarette drifted upward, dissolving into the vast sky, leaving no trace but memory. It was a fragile thing, easily overlooked, yet it carried with it all the weight of blurred boundaries, of kindness offered and received, of questions unanswered. And as night fell again, the prisoners lay in their barracks, the faint smell of smoke lingering in their clothes, wondering whether kindness was a gift, a trap, or perhaps both at once. The faint curl of smoke rose into the air, winding upward into the dark, leaving behind a silence heavy with doubt. The smoke curled upward into the sky, twisting in thin gray ribbons, dissolving into nothingness. Yet for the prisoners, that sight stirred memories darker than any gift of tobacco could soften. For smoke had long been the herald of destruction. In their minds, the curl of cigarette smoke blurred into other images, vast columns of black rising over burning cities, plumes that choked the sky as fire devoured wood and paper and human breath alike. The memory of fire bombings lingered within them, a scar not of flesh, but of spirit. And in the quiet camp, the sight of something so small and harmless brought back the terror of flames that had once swallowed their homeland. They remembered the air raid sirens, shrill and insistent, the frantic rush of feet toward shelters that could never truly shield them. They remembered the night skies streaked with light, flares dropping like false stars, then the roar of planes above, engines beating like war drums, and after the planes came the fire, falling in bundles, spreading across rooftops, racing through narrow streets where water was scarce and hope scarcer still. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours, reduced to embers and ash. Men recalled the smell of it, the stench of wood and flesh burned together, the way smoke clung to the throat until breathing itself became labor. For those who had seen their cities consumed, captivity was a paradox. Here, in the hands of the enemy, they were offered food, cigarettes, even ice cream. Yet back home, under the same enemy's planes, their families had faced fire that turned night into day and life into death. The contradiction was unbearable, as though the same hand that offered sweetness had also pressed flames against their roofs. How could one reconcile the guard who passed bread through the fence with the pilot who dropped bombs upon women and children? Were they not the same people, wearing the same flag, breathing the same air? This question haunted them more than hunger, more than shame. The small kindnesses of captivity could not erase the roar of firestorms that still echoed in memory. They saw again the rivers where people had plunged, desperate to escape the heat, only to find themselves boiled in the rising steam. They heard again the cries of children calling for mothers who no longer answered. They remembered the silence after the flames, when entire districts lay flat, reduced to blackened earth, the dead too many to count. No ice cream could erase that silence. No cigarette could drown the smell of burning that once filled the air. Yet memory is never simple. For in the camp, surrounded by guards who treated them with unexpected humanity, the prisoners were forced to face a truth more complicated than hatred alone. The same nation that destroyed their homes was now feeding them. The same people who had sent planes with bombs were sending guards with bread. It was as though mercy and cruelty had joined hands, indistinguishable, inseparable. And so the prisoners lived within contradiction, unable to condemn, unable to forgive, caught between memory of fire and presence of kindness. At night, when dreams came, fire often returned. A prisoner might close his eyes in the safety of the barrack, only to see again the glow of burning cities. He might hear the voices of his family crying, though he could not reach them. He might wake to the faint glow of a cigarette outside, mistaking it for the light of another flare. These dreams left men shaken, silent at dawn, their eyes clouded by a smoke no one else could see. The guards, perhaps unaware, went about their duties, and the camp fell back into its rhythm. But within the prisoners, fire smoldered, memory refusing to fade. The question whispered itself again and again. Can sweetness erase fire? Can a bowl of ice cream, a loaf of bread, a shared cigarette undo the horror of burning cities? Some prisoners thought it could not, that nothing could outweigh the loss. Others wondered if perhaps kindness now was a way of softening guilt, a way for the enemy to atone, if only in fragments. But no answer settled the heart. The contradiction remained, heavy as the smoke that once blotted out their skies. And yet, the memory of fire did not prevent them from tasting what was offered in the camp. Hunger and habit urged them to eat, to smoke, to take what came. To refuse would not bring back the dead. To resist kindness would not extinguish the fire already burned into their memories. And so they accepted, though each act carried with it a shadow. To eat was to remember who starved. To smoke was to recall who burned. To live was to carry the burden of all who had not. The camp's nights were quiet compared to the nights of firebombings, but in that very quiet lay unease. The absence of sirens, the stillness of the sky, the safety of sleep, all were reminders of what had been lost. For those who had survived the fire, silence itself could be haunting. It pressed upon them with a weight equal to the roar of planes, a reminder that they were alive when others were not. The smoke of a cigarette curled upward still, fragile, fleeting, yet it carried with it the memory of cities aflame. And as the prisoners watched it vanish into the dark, they could not decide whether they were comforted or tormented by its passing. Was it a symbol of peace or of destruction? Was it mercy, or was it only the shadow of fire disguised as something gentler? The smoke lingered in imagination long after it had disappeared, drifting through dreams, through silence, through memory. It blurred the boundary between kindness and cruelty, leaving the prisoners adrift in questions that no words could answer. The echo of sirens remained in their ears, faint but unending, as though still chasing them through the night. The echo of sirens lingered in their ears, even when the sky above the camp remained calm and clear. It was a phantom sound, born not of the present, but of memory, a sound that belonged to burning cities far away, yet followed them still. Then, piercing through that ghostly echo, came another signal, steady and undeniable, the ringing of the morning bell. The two sounds mingled for a moment, siren and bell, terror and routine, before the siren faded and only the bell remained, summoning the prisoners to rise, to gather, to step once more into the rhythm of captivity. The bell was not harsh, not like the whistles of their commanders in wartime, nor the shrieks of alarms that once warned of fire in the sky. It was dull, metallic, a sound that traveled across the camp with an air of inevitability rather than urgency. The men stirred from their mats, stretched stiff limbs, and prepared for another day that promised neither cruelty nor freedom. In its monotony, captivity became almost a second skin, one that chafed but could not be shed. And on this day, when the prisoners shuffled into line with bowls in hand, a murmur spread along the rows. It was a murmur of recognition, of anticipation, of disbelief turning slowly into expectation. For once again, there were tubs carried by the guards, cold breath rising from them in faint white curls. The men saw it, and though they tried to keep their faces still, their eyes betrayed them. Ice cream had returned. The second encounter was different from the first. The shock of that initial offering, the paralysis of disbelief, had already passed. Now the prisoners accepted the bowls with less hesitation, though still with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Some held their spoons firmly, determined to savor every mouthful. Others glanced quickly at their companions, as though seeking permission in their eyes. The sweetness was no longer a thunderclap in the mind, but a quieter echo, a gift still strange, yet less impossible. As they ate, the silence that once hung heavy now softened into something almost resembling calm. The men allowed themselves to notice the texture more clearly, the way the ice cream melted on the tongue, the faint chill that traveled from throat to chest. A few even closed their eyes for a moment, as though to hold the sensation more deeply, to stretch it across the hollow spaces of their captivity. The disbelief of the first time had given way to a cautious acceptance, though acceptance did not erase the questions that haunted them. Was this kindness ordinary for their captors, or extraordinary? Did the guards think of it as a gesture of mercy, or merely as routine provision? Did they know how profoundly it unsettled the men they served? For to the Americans, perhaps, it was nothing more than food, a treat distributed without ceremony. To the prisoners, it was a rupture in their understanding of the world, a reminder that reality was not bound by the lines of propaganda. And so the bowls emptied once again, spoons scraping at the last traces of sweetness, each man caught between satisfaction and sorrow. Some smiled faintly, almost without realizing, a flicker of expression quickly hidden. Others ate quickly, as though fearing that to linger too long on the pleasure would reveal too much of their weakness. But all, in their own way, carried the taste within them, a taste that refused to be dismissed, no matter how firmly they clung to silence. When the bowls were collected and the men dispersed, the camp resumed its rhythm. Work was assigned, tools distributed, fields tended, repairs made. The day stretched long beneath the sun, yet the memory of ice cream remained near the surface, like a small flame kept alive within the heart. It was a memory they did not speak of, yet each carried it, and in that unspoken bond lay a strange unity. The prisoners, who had once been bound by a code of death and loyalty, were now bound by the memory of sweetness in captivity. Perhaps it is in repetition that disbelief softens into acceptance. The first time, the ice cream had been an intrusion, a miracle that unsettled everything. The second time, it was no less remarkable, yet it became part of the fabric of camp life, woven into the rhythm of bells and bowls and footsteps. What had once seemed impossible began to feel like part of reality, though never fully explained. The prisoners did not understand it, but they no longer denied it. As the sun lowered in the sky, shadows stretched across the yard. The men returned to their barracks, their bodies weary, their minds quieter. In the silence of evening, the memory of sirens crept back, but it was tempered now by the clinking sound of metal trays, the memory of ice cream sliding across the tongue. Terror and sweetness, destruction and mercy. Sirens and bells. These contrasts wove themselves together, inseparable, leaving the men suspended between worlds. The day ended as it had begun, with routine, with silence, with questions left unanswered. Yet this time, the lingering sound was not of sirens in memory, but of trays being stacked, metal against metal, ringing faintly into the dusk. The clinking of trays lingered in the air, a hollow music that faded into night. The clinking of trays rang faintly, one against another, as the guards stacked them with the casual rhythm of routine. That metallic chorus drifted into the cooling air of evening, merging with the steady cadence of boots on gravel, until the camp seemed to hum with the sound of order itself. The prisoners, gathered back in their barracks, felt the resonance of that order settle over them like an invisible net. It was not violent, not sharp, but constant, an unyielding presence that pressed on every action, every silence, every breath. Order was the skeleton of the camp. The rising bell, the lines for food, the assignments for work, the return to quarters, the inspections. Each act flowed into the next, without deviation, without surprise. To the Americans, perhaps it was simply administration, a necessary routine to manage so many men. But to the prisoners, it was a rhythm that both confined and defined them. Their lives, once guided by the urgency of battle, the unpredictability of war, now unfolded in the measured steps of captivity. In that order, there was a strange echo of the discipline they had once known under the banner of their homeland. The Japanese soldier had been raised in the spirit of Bushido, the way of the warrior, where obedience and loyalty stood above all else. To march in line, to bow before superiors, to accept hardship without complaint. These had been the marks of honor. Now, within the camp, order still ruled them, though it came not from their own commanders, but from the enemy. The habits of discipline remained, yet their meaning blurred. Was it honor to obey now? Or was obedience merely survival, stripped of all nobility? Some men found comfort in the routine, the bell that signaled work, the whistle that marked meals, the guard's voice calling roll. All these gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into despair. To wake with purpose, however small, was to feel the persistence of being. Yet others found the order suffocating, a constant reminder that they lived under another's control. Each command carried not only authority, but humiliation, for to obey the enemy was to bow to a truth they had once sworn to resist. The discipline of captivity was not the discipline of choice, but of necessity. Still, it left its mark. Men walked in lines, not because they believed in the cause, but because the cause had vanished. They followed orders, not with pride, but because disobedience carried its own price. In this way, the body remembered what the spirit denied. Their movements remained soldierly, but their hearts were torn between loyalty and survival, between the honor they had been taught and the reality they now endured. As trays clinked together outside, one prisoner sat on the floor of the barrack, staring at his hands. He remembered the ceremonies of his youth, the drills, the shouted commands, the pride of belonging to something greater than himself. That pride had once been his armor, shielding him against fear. Now, stripped of rank, stripped of weapon, he was left only with the shell of discipline, hollow yet persistent. He obeyed because there was nothing else to do, but he wondered quietly whether obedience without belief was still a form of honor, or whether it was merely emptiness dressed in habit. Bushido had promised clarity. It had declared that the path of the warrior was simple: loyalty to the emperor, death before dishonor, courage before fear. Yet here, in the camp, clarity dissolved. Death was not demanded. Obedience was. Courage was not tested in battle. It was tested in silence, in endurance, in the quiet acceptance of a life shaped by another's rhythm. Could Bushido survive in such soil, or did it wither in the absence of sword and battlefield? Perhaps the true test of honor was not in dying, but in living through humiliation without surrendering entirely to despair. Some prisoners carried themselves with this belief, their backs straight, their faces calm, their words few. They accepted the routine with dignity, as though to show that even stripped of freedom, they could not be stripped of self. Others, however, felt the erosion more keenly. Each order obeyed seemed a fracture, each bow a betrayal, each step in line another reminder that the way of the warrior had led them not to glory, but to fences and bowls and silence. The Americans enforced order with firmness, but rarely with cruelty. The guards' shadows stretched long across the yard at dusk, moving with the slow weight of men accustomed to duty. Their presence was constant, their discipline evident, but they did not always carry the malice the prisoners expected. This, too, unsettled the captives. To be ruled with brutality would have been easier to endure, for it would have aligned with their expectations. To be ruled with order and relative fairness forced them again to question. If the enemy could hold power without cruelty, then what did that mean of their own understanding of dominance and honor? The clinking of trays outside faded as night drew deeper, replaced by the occasional cough, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of men settling into uneasy rest. But the rhythm of order remained, pulsing through the camp even in silence. It was in the placement of guards, in the alignment of bunks, in the rules that governed every action. It was in the way the prisoners' bodies moved without thought, shaped by commands they no longer believed in, yet could not escape. One might ask, is honor found in resisting such order, or in enduring it without collapse? Is discipline empty when it is imposed by the enemy, or does it still carry meaning, even when stripped of choice? These questions floated like shadows, unanswered, as the night deepened. Outside, a guard's lantern cast a long shape across the ground, stretching through the wire, reaching almost to the barracks. The prisoners lying awake could see it, flickering faintly, a reminder that order never slept, that power never withdrew. It was a shadow long and unbroken, stretching into their dreams, into their doubts, into the silence that no clinking tray could cover. And as the night wore on, The lantern's glow dimmed, leaving only the memory of a shadow stretching across the yard, endless and unresolved. The shadow stretched long across the yard, dark against the pale dust, reaching from the guard's lantern toward the barracks like a hand that could not be avoided. Within the dim light, the prisoners watched it move and lengthen, silent, unbroken. It was a reminder of hierarchy, of power that did not need to shout, for it was already present in every fence, every order, every ration passed from hand to hand. Yet in this shadow, cast by the enemy who both confined and fed them, lay a question that gnawed at the edges of thought. Could power be softened by compassion, or did compassion only sharpen the sense of captivity? The guards themselves were not uniform in manner. Some walked stiffly, eyes straight ahead, voices clipped, their authority clear. Others moved more slowly, hands in their pockets, offering a nod, a casual word, even a smile that startled the men it fell upon. These small gestures unsettled more than anger might have, for they suggested that the captors were not faceless, not monsters, but men with moods, tempers, and, most confusing of all, moments of kindness. Power was not always cruel. Sometimes it was indifferent, sometimes generous, and that very inconsistency made it harder to understand. The prisoners had once believed power to be simple. In the creed of their homeland, the strong commanded and the weak obeyed, and within this order, honor could be preserved through loyalty and sacrifice. But here, where the enemy held all authority, the structure blurred. When a guard handed out cigarettes, was it dominance or mercy? When a bowl of ice cream appeared, was it humiliation or generosity? To be kept alive by the enemy was itself a wound to pride, yet the wound deepened when life was not preserved with cruelty, but with unexpected care. Some prisoners avoided looking into the eyes of their captors, as though to do so might reveal too much, might invite doubt that they could not afford to carry. Others studied the guards in secret, noting the way they laughed among themselves, the way they adjusted their belts, the way their faces softened when speaking to one another. They were men, ordinary men, not the demons of wartime stories. And if they were men, then what did that mean of the war itself? The shadow stretched into the barracks at night, but within the minds of the prisoners it stretched further still, into the realm of questions that had no answers. Was true dominance found in cruelty, or was it found in the ability to be merciful? If an enemy spared your life, fed your hunger, allowed you to endure, was he less your enemy, or was he more so, for holding your existence in his hands? These thoughts gnawed quietly, unspoken, for to share them might be dangerous, might sound like weakness, and so they lived with their silence, each man carrying his own interpretation of the shadow that ruled them. One evening, as the sun sank low and the yard glowed in orange light, a guard dropped a piece of bread while distributing rations. It fell into the dust, and before he could stoop, one of the prisoners bent to pick it up. For a moment, the air froze, for both men reached at once, their hands meeting above the ground. Their eyes met briefly, an exchange with no words, no gesture, just the recognition of two men bending over the same scrap of food. The guard stepped back and allowed the prisoner to keep it. The shadow of power remained, but in that instant, compassion had brushed against it. The prisoners who saw it never spoke of it, but the image lived in their minds long after. Perhaps power is most deeply felt not in the moments of command, but in the moments when it chooses restraint. The guards could have been cruel, but often they were not. They could have withheld, but sometimes they shared. This unsettled the prisoners more than any lash would have, for it forced them to see that power is not always simple, and that mercy itself can become a burden. To be shown kindness by the enemy is to carry a debt that cannot be repaid, and in that debt lies humiliation as sharp as any chain. At night, when the lantern cast its glow across the yard, the prisoners lay on their mats and watched the shadow move. Some saw in it the weight of control, unrelenting, a reminder that they were no longer men, but captives. Others saw in it a paradox, a power that could command, but also could care. And still others closed their eyes tightly, refusing to think, refusing to feel. For thought itself could become unbearable. The hierarchy of the camp was clear. Guards outside, prisoners inside, orders flowing in one direction only. Yet within that clarity lived an ambiguity, the way a lantern flame can flicker, its shadow shifting on the wall. If the enemy could be merciful, then perhaps mercy itself was a form of dominance, and perhaps compassion was only another tool of control. Or perhaps compassion was genuine, uncalculated, the simple act of men toward men, even in war. The prisoners could not decide, and so the shadow stretched on, long and unresolved. Late into the night, the lantern was finally extinguished, and the yard fell into darkness. The shadow vanished, but its memory remained, cast not on the ground, but within the hearts of those who had seen it. And as the darkness deepened, footsteps receded into the horizon, their sound fading until only silence remained. The silence carried with it the echo of those steps, steady and distant, like questions walking away into the night. The footsteps receded into the horizon, soft at first, then fainter still, until they dissolved into silence so complete that it seemed to press against the walls of the barracks. The prisoners lay in that silence, staring upward at beams of rough wood, their thoughts wandering back to the moment when footsteps had carried them not into captivity, but into surrender. That day lived within them like a wound that refused to close, and each time the sound of boots moved away into distance, they were drawn again to the memory of laying down their weapons, of hands raised in gestures they had never imagined they would make. The memory of surrender was heavy, not because of the act alone, but because of what it meant to men raised to believe surrender was worse than death. They had been taught from their first days in uniform that the true soldier fought until his body could fight no more, that capture was a stain upon his honor and upon the name of his family. Yet when the moment came, when ammunition ran dry, when comrades fell one by one, when the sky above filled with the enemy's fire, the body chose life over death. Hands opened, rifles slipped from fingers, flags were lowered, and in that instant they became prisoners, neither warriors nor free men, suspended in a space they had never thought to occupy. The humiliation of that moment lingered with them in every movement of captivity. To walk in line, to receive food from the enemy, to sleep in barracks watched by foreign guards, all these were daily reminders of the day they surrendered. Some had wept openly in that moment, tears of rage, of shame, of disbelief. Others had stood stiffly, faces turned away, determined to let no expression betray their despair. Yet all had felt it, the collapse of the image they had carried for so long, the image of the warrior who dies with honor rather than live in defeat. The bitterness of surrender was sharper than hunger, sharper even than fear, for hunger could be borne, and fear could be mastered, but shame burrowed into the soul. The prisoners carried it with them as invisibly as they carried their memories, each man haunted by the knowledge that he had not chosen death when the chance came. In the eyes of his homeland, he had failed, and no act in captivity could erase that failure. And yet, The surrender had not been without reason. Some men had looked at the faces of their comrades, at the hollow cheeks and trembling hands, and chosen life not only for themselves, but for those who remained. Some had thought of families waiting at home, of mothers and wives who would weep whether they died or lived, and decided that survival, however bitter, might yet serve those who loved them. But such reasons were difficult to speak aloud. Better to hide behind silence than to confess that they had chosen to live when others had chosen to die. In the quiet of the camp, the memory returned in flashes, the sound of weapons clattering to the ground, the sight of an enemy soldier motioning them forward, his rifle steady, but his face unreadable. The strange calm that followed when the expected cruelty did not come, when instead they were gathered, counted, and marched away. That march was itself a humiliation, for each step carried them farther from the image of warriors and deeper into the reality of prisoners. The road stretched endlessly, lined with silence, broken only by the shuffling of their own feet, and in each step they felt the weight of what they had lost. To live with that memory in captivity was to carry two burdens at once, the burden of survival and the burden of shame. Each meal, each gesture of kindness from the enemy, pressed the shame more deeply into the heart. For how could a man reconcile the taste of ice cream with the memory of surrender? How could he allow himself to enjoy sweetness when his honor had already melted away like snow in the sun? Some refused to taste it for this reason, holding fast to hunger as though hunger itself were the last thread of dignity they could grasp. Others tasted and wept in silence, their tears falling not for the sweetness itself, but for what it revealed about their condition. The culture of their homeland had given them no language for this. Bushido had spoken of courage, of loyalty, of sacrifice, but it had not spoken of men who lived after surrender, who endured captivity without glory. They were left in a silence that no code could explain, a silence filled with questions that pressed against the heart like stones. Was it dishonor to live? Or was it dishonor to abandon life when it was still given? Could surrender ever be more than shame? Or was it always a stain that no act could cleanse? The prisoners carried these questions like invisible chains, heavier than the wire that enclosed them. At night, when the barracks grew still and the guards' footsteps faded, the memory of surrender returned, vivid and unrelenting. Some dreamed of the moment, waking with a start, their breath caught in their throats. Others lay awake, eyes open, replaying the scene again and again, as though searching for a way to alter it in memory, to find courage they had not found in reality. But memory could not be altered, and the truth remained. They had surrendered, and nothing could change that. And yet, perhaps there was another truth, one that lingered beneath the shame. To live on was itself an act of defiance against death, even if it was not the defiance they had been taught to admire. To endure captivity, to face each day with silent strength, required a courage of another kind, quieter, less celebrated, but real nonetheless. Some prisoners began to sense this, though they did not speak of it. They rose with dignity, walked with calm, obeyed without servility. In their silence, they preserved something that no defeat could take. Still, the memory of surrender did not release them. It clung like a shadow, following them wherever they went, long and unbroken, just as the guard's lantern had cast its shadow across the yard. The surrender was their first step into captivity, and every step since had been shaped by it. To live as a prisoner was to live in its echo, to carry its weight in every gesture, every breath, every silence. In the barrack, as night deepened and the world grew still, one prisoner turned his face away, eyes fixed on the wall. He would not look at his companions, for in their silence he heard his own shame reflected. He closed his eyes, but the memory did not fade. It waited for him, patient and unyielding, in the darkness behind his lids. And so the night stretched on, heavy with the memory of surrender, heavy with the silence of men who could not speak of what they had lost. A face turned away in silence lingered in the dimness, unresolved, as though hiding from questions that could not be answered. The face turned away in silence lingered in the dimness, not only to hide from the eyes of companions, but also to turn from the gaze of memory itself. For within each prisoner lay a mirror no one wished to face, a reflection of shame that words could never fully carry. Shame lived in the bones, in the quiet, in the way a man avoided the eyes of another, not because he despised his comrade, but because he saw in him his own failure. This was the deepest wound of captivity. Not the fences, not the commands of the guards, not even the hunger, but the knowledge that they had lived past the moment when they were supposed to die. Shame pressed upon them like a second shadow, unseen but always present. It clung to their movements, it silenced their tongues, it shaped their dreams. For in the homeland, they had been told again and again that surrender was unforgivable, that capture was dishonor that would stain not only the soldier, but also his family. A man who fell in battle could be remembered as noble, but a man who lived on in the enemy's hands was remembered as a ghost, half alive, unworthy. To carry that weight while breathing, while eating, while walking through the days, was to bear an invisible chain heavier than the barbed wire itself. And yet, shame did not stand alone. With it came guilt, heavy and unspoken. Some prisoners remembered the faces of comrades who had chosen death rather than capture, who had leapt into gunfire, who had clutched grenades to their chests, who had shouted final words before silence claimed them. Those men had fulfilled the creed, had taken the path of honor as it was taught. The survivors wondered, endlessly, why they themselves had not followed. Was it weakness? Was it fear? Was it some hidden desire to live at any cost? Each man carried his own answer, but none dared to voice it aloud, for to speak would be to expose a wound too raw. The guilt deepened when they thought of home, parents, wives, children. They would not know how their captured sons and husbands had chosen life, and if they did know, what would they think? Would they mourn them as though already dead, for shame was a death of another kind? Would they curse them in silence, ashamed to bear the name of a man who had surrendered? This question gnawed like hunger, leaving men restless in the night, their thoughts circling endlessly. It is said that chains of the body can be broken, but chains of the mind bind far more deeply. In captivity, the body endured routines and labor, but the mind endured the ceaseless weight of shame and guilt. Even moments of sweetness, ice cream on the tongue, smoke from a cigarette, became reminders of this weight, for they revealed that life still held pleasures, however small. And with those pleasures came the guilt of enjoying them, while others had chosen the purity of death. Could a man savor sweetness and still call himself a soldier? Could he smile, even faintly, without betraying those who had fallen? These questions sat heavily on their chests, pressing until the act of breathing itself felt difficult. The silence of the barracks was filled with these questions, though no man spoke them. Each prisoner became an island, carrying within him a storm he dared not share. To speak of shame would be to expose weakness. To confess guilt would be to invite condemnation. and so they turned their faces away, each man staring at the wall, at the ceiling, at the ground, hiding not from each other, but from themselves. Some found small rituals to bear the weight. One man would sit upright each morning before dawn, bowing silently toward the east, as though to remind himself of his homeland, to pledge in silence that though he lived in captivity, his spirit had not surrendered. Another would carve small marks into wood, not as a measure of time, but as a reminder that he still had form, still had will. Others clung to silence itself, treating it as a shield, a way to endure without giving the enemy or even their comrades the satisfaction of hearing their weakness. But silence is not without cracks. In moments of exhaustion, in dreams that spilled into whispers, the truth sometimes escaped. A man might murmur the name of a fallen comrade, or cry out in his sleep, as though reliving the moment of surrender. At such times, the barrack grew even quieter, as though the others were listening without listening, granting the mercy of unspoken understanding. No one mocked, no one condemned, for each knew that within himself the same shame and guilt lived, restless and unyielding. The weight of shame was not only personal, it was collective. An entire nation's teaching pressed upon them, the voice of commanders and teachers, of parents and priests, whispering in memory that a captured soldier was worse than no soldier at all. That whisper became louder in captivity, for silence amplifies what the heart cannot silence, and so the prisoners lived beneath this chorus, bearing it as they bore the heat of the sun, the cold of the night, the scrape of bowls. Yet in the quietest moments, when the wind rustled the flags that hung limp above the camp, a different thought crept in, fragile but persistent. Was shame truly so absolute? Could it be that survival itself, though condemned by their creed, held a kind of meaning? Could it be that by living, even in captivity, they bore witness to truths their fallen comrades would never know? This thought was dangerous, for it suggested that shame might not be eternal, that guilt might not be the only inheritance. But it flickered nonetheless, faint as a candle in the wind. The prisoners did not speak of this possibility, but it lived in the silence, in the way some men straightened their backs even while eating, in the way others bowed their heads not in humiliation, but in quiet endurance. Shame was heavy, but it was not the only weight they carried. Somewhere beneath it lay the stubbornness of survival, the small spark that refused to die even when all else was stripped away. And so the camp lay in silence, faces turned away, shadows cast long by the moonlight. The prisoners carried their shame and guilt as though carrying stones in their chests, invisible yet crushing. No words passed between them, yet the air itself was thick with their burden. Outside, a faint breeze stirred, catching the edge of a flag and making it tremble. The cloth rustled softly, a sound almost too light to notice, yet it carried across the yard and into the barracks, brushing against the silence like a question unasked. The faint breeze rustled the camp flags, their movement uncertain, unresolved, as though they too were caught between pride and surrender. The faint breeze rustled the camp flags, their cloth stirring as though reluctant to move, caught between stillness and motion. The sound brushed into the barracks, delicate, almost like a whisper. Some prisoners lifted their eyes toward it, for even a slight change in the air could ripple through days otherwise bound by routine. The flags trembled, symbols of power and control, yet also fabric, fragile, worn by weather, just as men were worn by time. And beneath that trembling, another movement began, quieter, less visible, yet just as persistent. For slowly, inevitably, cultural boundaries softened, much like the fabric loosening under the wind. It began in fragments, half-formed words carried across the yard. Guards spoke in their language, commands clipped, phrases repeated, gestures filling the space where comprehension failed. The prisoners listened, caught at first in confusion, then slowly, carefully, began to recognize sounds. A word for food, a word for work, a word for wait. Not all learned, but many did. For even in captivity, the human mind seeks to grasp meaning, to find connection in sound. These scraps of English became a kind of secret treasure. A man might whisper them to himself in the dark, repeating, shaping his tongue around unfamiliar syllables. In doing so, he bridged a small distance between himself and his captor, though the bridge was fragile and incomplete. Cultural exchange wasn't taught formally. It emerged from necessity, from chance, from the stubborn persistence of human contact. A guard dropped something, perhaps a glove, perhaps a pencil, and a prisoner stooped to return it. Eyes met briefly, a word was spoken, a gesture made. In that instant, an exchange occurred, not of goods, but of recognition. The enemy had hands, had eyes, had words that carried tone and inflection, sometimes harsh, sometimes not. Each such moment blurred the stark image once painted by propaganda. Some prisoners watched carefully, noting the way Americans carried themselves, the way they laughed freely, voices rising into the air without hesitation. Laughter was not absent in the camp, but among the Japanese it was restrained, quiet, often hidden. To hear guards laugh so openly, so easily, unsettled and fascinated them. Did laughter not betray weakness? Or was it another kind of strength, to express so freely without fear of judgment? In silence, the prisoners considered this, though none would dare to speak it aloud. Music, too, drifted across the boundaries. On certain evenings, when guards gathered in their own quarters, the strum of a guitar or the hum of a tune could be heard faintly through the night. The notes carried into the barracks, where prisoners lay listening, unable to stop their minds from conjuring images. The sound was foreign, yet oddly familiar, for melody itself needs no translation. Some men closed their eyes and thought of festivals in their villages, of drums and flutes, of songs sung in unison. The guitar's voice was different, yet it spoke the same language of longing, of joy, of life beyond fences. Through these fragments, glimpses of American ways emerged. The guards chewed gum, a habit strange to the prisoners, who marveled at the constant motion of jaws, the scent of mint lingering in the air. They smoked often, holding cigarettes with casual ease, exhaling clouds as though time itself could be breathed away. They walked with a looseness unfamiliar to men trained to march in rigid lines, their posture less bound, their steps unhurried. To Japanese eyes, these gestures seemed careless, yet there was strength in their ease, a freedom in their bearing that contrasted sharply with the tight discipline once drilled into the prisoners' own bodies. The prisoners could not help but compare. Their own culture had taught restraint, endurance, silence as strength. Here they saw openness, laughter, abundance shown without shame. Which was stronger? Which was more human? These questions rustled through their minds like the flags in the breeze, moving but never settling. On rare occasions, exchanges went further. A guard, curious, asked a prisoner's name. The prisoner hesitated, then spoke, his accent thick, his voice low. The guard repeated it, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables, then laughed, not in mockery, but in genuine amusement at his own clumsiness. For a moment, the prisoner almost smiled, though quickly he hid it. In that small act, a thread was woven, fragile but undeniable. Names were shared, and in sharing, enmity thinned, if only for a heartbeat. Yet every glimpse of humanity carried danger. To see the enemy as human was to risk softening the wall that preserved one's pride. The prisoners wrestled with this in silence, uncertain whether to welcome these fragments of exchange or to resist them. To learn a word of English might feel like a betrayal of the homeland, yet it might also feel like a survival tool, a way to navigate captivity with less friction. To hear a song might comfort, but it might also wound, reminding them of what was lost. To see a guard's laughter might humanize him, but it might also erode the hatred that once gave them purpose. The breeze tugged at the flags again, their cloth rustling like whispered words. The prisoners listened without meaning to, hearing not only the sound of fabric, but the echo of questions they could not resolve. What do we learn of our enemies when the war still rages outside? Is it betrayal to recognize their humanity, or is it betrayal to deny what is plain before the eyes? The war beyond the fences continued, battles fought, bombs falling, lives ending, and yet, within the camp, the fragments of cultural exchange persisted. Small gestures, stray words, faint songs that suggested another reality altogether. As night deepened, the breeze grew cooler, the flag stilled, and silence returned. But the questions lingered, drifting like the fragments of song, like words half understood, like gestures half forgotten. A word lingered in the air, half understood, neither fully theirs nor fully foreign, unresolved, waiting for meaning to be found. The word lingered in the air, half understood, its sound suspended between two languages, like a bridge that reached but never quite touched the other side. It hung there, uncertain, and in that uncertainty lay possibility. For once a word is spoken, even if not fully grasped, it invites response. A prisoner repeated it softly, his accent bending its edges, while a guard chuckled and tried again, slower this time. The exchange was clumsy, filled with pauses, but it was not empty. Out of such fragments, stories began to emerge, not told in grand speeches, not in eloquent narratives, but in gestures, in broken words, in sounds that hinted at something larger. At first, these stories were simple, almost accidental. A guard pointed at an object, named it in his tongue, waited for the prisoner to mimic the sound. The prisoner, hesitant, obliged. Laughter followed, not cruel, but warm, as though they had stumbled together into the absurdity of two worlds colliding. The prisoner in turn spoke a word from his own language, short, sharp, foreign to the guard's ear. The guard repeated, stumbling in his own way, and now it was the prisoner who allowed a faint smile. In this rhythm of exchange, something unexpected unfolded, not only the sharing of words, but the recognition that language itself could be a fragile bond, even in captivity. Stories deepened through other means as well. Gestures became narratives when words failed. A guard mimed holding a fishing pole, reeling in an imagined catch, his face bright with exaggeration. A prisoner, understanding, nodded and returned the gesture with his own pantomime of planting rice, his hand spreading as though scattering seed into invisible water. The two laughed, not because the acts themselves were humorous, but because the barrier between them had thinned, if only for a moment. Neither needed to know the full sentences of the other. The story lived in the gestures, in the recognition of labor, of livelihood, of life beyond war. On certain evenings, as twilight spread its long shadows across the camp, music wove itself into these exchanges. A guard with a guitar strummed softly, plucking out tunes that drifted into the barracks like smoke curling through the air. The prisoners listened in silence, at first wary, then drawn in by the rhythm. Music required no translation. The strum of strings, the rise and fall of melody, spoke to something older than language. Some prisoners closed their eyes and felt themselves carried to memories of home. Festival drums echoing through village streets, the sound of flutes weaving through summer air, voices lifted in songs of ancestors. The guitar was foreign, yet it awakened what was familiar, stirring hearts that had grown heavy with silence. One night, as the music drifted, a prisoner hummed softly, almost without realizing it. The note was low, tentative, barely audible. Another prisoner joined, adding a second tone, hesitant but clear. Soon a thin thread of song emerged, weaving itself into the guitar's strum. It was not loud, not bold, but fragile, like a lantern flickering against wind. The guards heard and paused, surprised, then continued playing, slower now, as though listening for the rhythm of the prisoner's hum. In that moment, music became a shared story, spoken in no language, told across the boundary of wire and uniform. Such exchanges were never official, never encouraged, yet they lingered in memory as deeply as any ration or command. For in those fragments of humanity, the prisoners glimpsed something that both comforted and unsettled them. That the enemy was not faceless, not purely cruel, but capable of laughter, of music, of small kindness, and with that realization came the question that haunted them even more than hunger or shame. If the enemy was human, then what was the meaning of the war that had set them against one another? The propaganda of their homeland had painted the Americans as devils, grotesque and merciless. Yet the devils played music. They stumbled over foreign words with patience. They laughed at their own clumsiness. They shared cigarettes, passed bread, offered ice cream. How could these truths live beside the memories of firebombs, of ruined cities, of sirens echoing through the night? The contradiction was unbearable, yet undeniable. War demanded hatred, but reality whispered of common humanity. The prisoners carried this tension silently. In the daylight, they returned to their routines, bowed their heads, spoke little. But in the quiet of night, when a tune drifted or a word lingered, they allowed themselves to feel what they could not say. They remembered their families, their festivals, the laughter of children. They remembered that before they were soldiers, they had been men, and that the guards before them were also men, shaped by another land, another language, yet not so different. The half-understood word became a seed, planting itself in the silence of their thoughts. Each time a prisoner tried to speak it, clumsily imitating the sound, he crossed a boundary, however small. Each time a guard laughed with him rather than at him, the boundary shifted further still. Stories grew in these spaces, not full stories, but fragments that suggested more. A gesture of fishing, a tune of longing, a shared smile over mispronounced syllables. And perhaps it was in fragments, rather than in full narratives, that the truest stories of captivity were told. Yet the prisoners were wary, for they knew that to embrace these exchanges too fully was to risk loosening the grip on their identity. To learn too much of the enemy was to risk seeing him not as foe, but as fellow. And so they balanced, teetering between openness and silence, between recognition and denial. The stories lived in small spaces, fragile and fleeting, never spoken too loudly, never allowed to grow too bold. As the night deepened, the guitar strummed one last time, a final chord hanging in the air. The prisoners listened, holding the sound within them like a memory too fragile to touch. Then silence returned, heavy, complete, the music fading into darkness. Yet within that silence, the echo of the tune lingered, just as the half-understood word had lingered before, both unresolved, both inviting meaning that might never fully come. The strum of a guitar drifted into the night, its final note trembling like a question left unanswered. The guitar string hummed one last time, fading into the stillness until only its echo remained, trembling within the wooden beams of the barracks, then slipping quietly into silence. Yet in the minds of the prisoners, the note did not vanish. It lingered, a humming beneath their thoughts, shaping their dreams as they drifted into uneasy sleep. And in those dreams, carried on the vibration of a fading chord, many of them found themselves returning not to the battlefield, nor to the camp, but to the memory of home. The dreams came gently, as though borne on the sound itself, carrying them back to narrow streets and festival lanterns swaying in the summer air. They saw again the stalls of their youth, bright with color, alive with voices, filled with the scents of grilled fish, of steaming rice cakes, of sweet syrup poured over shaved ice. They remembered the laughter of children running between the stalls, their hands sticky with candy, their cheeks red from excitement. They remembered music, the rhythm of drums, the shrill cry of flutes, the chanting voices that rose together in joy. These were not grand memories of victory or glory, but small, human moments that returned now in the fragile space of dreams. The ice cream of the camp, so strange and bewildering, merged in their minds with these memories. It became not only the taste of captivity, but also the echo of sweets once shared in childhood. A man might dream of standing at a festival stall, holding a bowl of shaved ice dripping with syrup, only to realize, as the dream shifted, that it had become the enemy's ice cream melting on a wooden spoon. Another might dream of his mother placing a small, sweet bun in his hand, only to find the taste mingling with the cold, unfamiliar richness of cream. The two worlds blurred together until they could not be separated. For some, the dreams brought comfort. To remember home, even in fragments, was to feel warmth return to a heart grown heavy with silence. The sound of a child's laughter, the glow of lantern light, the taste of sugar on the tongue. These were reminders that life was not only war and shame, but also joy, fragile and fleeting, yet real. Others woke from such dreams with sorrow, for the sweetness of memory made the bitterness of captivity sharper. To see home so vividly in sleep, only to wake to fences and guards, was a cruelty of another kind. Still, the dreams persisted. They came not as choice, but as necessity, for the heart, burdened by shame and silence, sought refuge in the past. The guitar string that had faded into night became the thread that bound them to memory, and memory became the only place where they could live as men rather than prisoners. In dreams, they were not bound by wire. In dreams, they walked freely through streets lit with lanterns, their steps unguarded, their voices unbroken. One prisoner, lying awake after such a dream, thought of the sweets his grandmother once made, small rice cakes filled with sweet bean paste, wrapped in leaves to keep them fresh. He could almost taste them still, the soft texture, the faint bitterness of the beans balanced by sugar. He thought of how, as a child, he had eaten too quickly, eager for more, while his grandmother laughed softly at his impatience. That memory, once ordinary, now felt like a treasure greater than any weapon or uniform. Another prisoner remembered the first time he had tasted ice in summer, shaved fine and topped with syrup so brightly colored it seemed unreal. He had been no more than 10, and he had laughed at the cold shock on his tongue, his friends around him doing the same. That memory returned now, interwoven with the strange ice cream of captivity, leaving him both comforted and unsettled. Such dreams and memories were not spoken of in the camp, yet they lived silently within each man. They became a second existence, one carried in the night while the day belonged to order and routine. Perhaps it was this inner world that allowed them to endure, for even as fences enclosed their bodies, memory opened doors no guard could close. But memory was fragile, like the flicker of lanterns against night wind. As the years of war stretched on, details blurred. The sound of a mother's voice faded. The lines of a child's face grew indistinct. The taste of sweets dimmed. What remained were fragments, light, sound, scent, that the heart clung to as though to preserve identity itself. In captivity, the fear of forgetting became as great as the shame of surrender. To forget was to lose not only home, but also the self. And so the prisoners repeated these memories in silence, turning them over like beads in prayer, each detail polished by thought until it shone, even if the original had long vanished. The guitar string had faded, but its echo lived on in these remembered festivals, in these imagined sweets. It was as though the music had opened a door within them, a door to a past that both comforted and wounded. They could not remain in those dreams, yet they could not live without them. And so each night, as silence deepened and shadows lengthened, they surrendered themselves to memory, letting it carry them where reality could not. Outside the barracks, a lantern flickered in the distance, its flame bending in the breeze, glowing and dimming, glowing again. To some who saw it through cracks in the wall, it seemed like the lanterns of festivals past, fragile against the dark, yet stubborn in their light. To others, it was only a guard's lamp, a symbol of confinement. But perhaps it was both, a reminder that even in captivity, the mind could still wander, could still find light in memory, however faint. The lantern flickered in the distance, its glow trembling against the night, unresolved, like a dream that would not fade. The lantern flickered in the distance, its glow trembling against the dark, as though it could not decide whether to remain or to fade. Through the night it wavered, a fragile sentinel, until at last its flame softened and was swallowed by the first pale light of dawn. The prisoners stirred in their barracks, their eyes opening to the slow shift of shadow into day. The transition was quiet, neither sudden nor dramatic, just the steady encroachment of morning, and with it the return of the camp's rhythm. The lantern's glow blended into the rising sun, its brief struggle forgotten, replaced by the certainty of another day. Dawn in the camp was neither harsh nor kind. It was indifferent. The bell rang as it always did, steady and dull, summoning the men to rise, to line up, to step again into the order that framed their captivity. They obeyed, as they always had, their bodies moving with a practiced slowness, each gesture familiar, each motion repeated countless times, and yet within them, beneath the surface of routine, memories stirred, memories that refused to fade, even as the lantern's light did. Among these, none was more persistent than the memory of ice cream. It was strange, perhaps, that such a small detail should linger so vividly when so many larger events, battles, marches, even surrender itself, blurred into shadows. But memory does not always honor the weight of history. It clings instead to sensations, to tastes, to small fragments that defy expectation. The prisoners had expected hunger, cruelty, and despair. They had not expected the cold sweetness of cream melting on the tongue. that memory remained, unshakable, as though it had etched itself into the very fabric of their captivity. Days passed, each shaped by the same order: morning roll, work assignments, meals, inspections, evenings of silence. Yet beneath this monotony, the memory of ice cream persisted, flaring at odd moments, unbidden. A man stooping to drink water felt the coldness against his throat and thought of it. Another, licking a grain of sugar from the rim of a tin cup, recalled the sweetness that had once stunned him. Even in dreams, the memory returned, mingling with images of home, of festivals, of sweets once shared in childhood. It was more than a taste. It was a symbol, a riddle they could not solve. For what did it mean, this ice cream offered by the enemy? Was it generosity, or was it power disguised? Was it mercy, or mockery? The question haunted them, because the answer could not be found. Each man interpreted it differently, and yet all carried it. To some, it was proof that the enemy was not the monster they had been told to hate. To others, it was a trap, a way of softening their spirits, of eroding their pride. But whether they accepted or resisted, the memory remained. The taste could not be untasted. The moment could not be undone. The persistence of the memory revealed something larger, though few dared to admit it even to themselves. War had been painted in absolutes: friend and foe, honor and shame, life and death. Yet the ice cream belonged to none of these categories. It was neither victory nor defeat, neither cruelty nor kindness alone. It was something in between, something ordinary that became extraordinary because it contradicted everything they believed. And in that contradiction lay its power. The prisoners lived in contradiction every day. They were soldiers without weapons, men without freedom, humans who survived where they had been taught to die. Their lives within the camp did not fit the stories told back home, nor the creed of Bushido, nor the expectations of either side. And so the ice cream became a fitting symbol, an ordinary sweetness that carried within it all the strangeness of their existence. It reminded them that nothing was as simple as they had been told, that the enemy could both destroy and nourish, that captivity could both humiliate and sustain. As dawn stretched into morning, the prisoners moved through their routines. Work was done, food was distributed, guards paced. The day was like countless others, yet beneath its surface lay the memory that would not leave. Some tried to bury it, to focus on the labor before them, to silence the questions it raised. But others carried it openly in their minds, as though savoring the contradiction itself. Perhaps they sensed that the memory would outlast the fences, outlast the war, outlast even themselves. When evening came again, the camp settled into quiet. The men returned to their barracks, their bowls emptied, their bodies weary. One prisoner placed his cup down on the floor beside him, absent-mindedly, leaving a ring of moisture on the wood. He stared at it for a long moment, watching the circle spread, darkening the grain before slowly fading. The image reminded him of the ice cream, of its coldness melting into liquid, leaving traces that disappeared yet could not be forgotten. The ring of moisture remained for a time, faint, unresolved, as though it too carried a memory that lingered longer than its shape. The ring of moisture spread outward on the wooden floor, widening slowly until it thinned into the grain and vanished. Yet even when the circle was gone, the memory of it remained, like a trace pressed invisibly into the mind. So too would the experiences of captivity remain after the fences were dismantled, after the war ended, after the men were sent back across seas to the homeland they had long imagined in silence. The war would conclude, the shadows of the camp would recede, but the memory of ice cream in the enemy's hand would not dissolve so easily. When at last the war ended, when the gates were opened and the prisoners were told they would return home, many felt a weight lift only to find another weight waiting in its place. Freedom was not the simple release they had once dreamed of. To return meant to face families who had believed them dead. Or worse, families who had believed them dishonored by survival. To return meant to step back into a land scarred by fire, hunger, and loss. A land where silence about captivity was often heavier than speech. The voyage back was filled with unease. Men stood on ship decks, staring at the horizon, each lost in thought. Some rehearsed the words they might speak to their families, only to find none sufficient. Others resolved to remain silent, to let the years of captivity vanish unspoken, as though silence itself might cleanse the shame. But within each, the memory of small contradictions stirred, the kindness of guards, the rhythm of the camp, the taste of ice cream. These details burned quietly, refusing to be extinguished. Upon reaching Japan, many discovered a homeland altered beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, streets flattened into dust, families scattered, hunger sharper than ever. Survivors of the fire bombings lived among ashes, their eyes hollow with loss. For the returning soldiers, the shock of this devastation was almost greater than the shock of captivity. They had imagined home as it was, yet they found a homeland reshaped by ruin. The silence between themselves and those they returned to grew heavier still. For how could they speak of what they had seen? Could a man who had eaten ice cream in captivity confess it to a mother who had starved through winter? Could a soldier who had been fed bread by the enemy tell his wife, who had sold her last possessions for millet, that he had survived on rations given freely by guards? Could a man who had listened to music in camp describe it to children who had heard only the drone of sirens and the roar of bombs? To tell the truth was to risk disbelief, even anger, and so many remained silent, swallowing their stories like stones. Among comrades, sometimes, whispers surfaced. A man might murmur that the Americans were not always cruel, that some guards treated them with fairness, even with humanity. Another might mention the day of ice cream, almost in disbelief even as he recalled it. But such words were spoken only in corners, behind closed doors, quickly buried again. The public story of war demanded clarity, enemy and ally, cruelty and suffering, shame and endurance. The private story, filled with contradictions, did not fit. In time, historians and writers would collect fragments of these memories, piecing together the strangeness of captivity. But in the years immediately after the war, such stories rarely found voice. The men who carried them often kept them locked within, unshared even with those closest to them. Some never spoke of it at all, letting the memory of ice cream in captivity remain a secret that died with them. Others hinted at it only in old age, when the weight of silence had grown too heavy to bear alone. Yet the memory did not vanish. Like the ring of moisture left by a cup, it spread quietly through time, fading but never erased. It lived in the minds of those who carried it, resurfacing in dreams, in sudden recollections, in the taste of something sweet eaten years later. It lived, too, in the strangeness of their posture, in the pauses of their speech, in the way they turned away when asked of their time in the war. Silence became the form memory took, but silence did not mean absence. Perhaps it was in silence that the memory found its truest expression. For ice cream in captivity was more than sweetness. It was contradiction made tangible, a symbol of mercy within cruelty, abundance within deprivation, humanity within enmity. To speak of it was to unravel certainties that a nation clung to in the aftermath of defeat. To remain silent was to preserve those certainties, even if it meant carrying the burden alone. The prisoners chose silence, not because the memory was small, but because it was too large, too strange, too unresolved. Still, in quiet moments, when waves broke against the shore, when families gathered around sparse meals, when the sound of a festival drum echoed faintly from afar, the memory returned. The prisoners who had lived through captivity felt it stir within them, the taste of ice melting on a spoon, the astonishment of receiving sweetness from the enemy, the confusion that no words could cleanse. They carried it as they carried their shame, their guilt, their endurance, silently, persistently, as part of themselves. The waves against the shore seemed to echo this silence, carrying away words never spoken, returning only the rhythm of questions unresolved. The sound of waves against the shore lingered, endless and unresolved, as though it too carried stories that could not be spoken. The sound of waves against the shore lingered, their rhythm eternal, carrying with them voices that seemed almost human. For waves are the keepers of memory, rolling endlessly, repeating what was once said and what was left unspoken. To those who returned from captivity, the waves seemed to echo their own silence, speaking where they could not, reminding them that the past is never gone, only carried differently. In time, as years unfolded, those silences began to loosen, and fragments of the strange story they bore, of ice cream in captivity, slipped into the world beyond the camp and the home. Survivors, when old age softened the sharp edges of shame, began to speak in cautious tones. Historians listened, collecting these fragments, shaping them into narratives that puzzled as much as they revealed. It was not the grand battles, the sweeping strategies, the victories or defeats that fascinated those who heard these stories. It was the detail, the shock of sweetness, the cold of ice on the tongue that held their attention. For in that detail lay a truth larger than statistics, larger even than battles. The reminder that war is not only destruction, but also contradiction, and that within its cruelty there can appear moments so gentle, so strange, they cannot be forgotten. Readers who encountered these accounts shook their heads in disbelief. Could it be true, they wondered, that Japanese prisoners, braced for starvation and brutality, had been given ice cream by their captors? The detail seemed almost absurd, almost too ordinary to belong to war. And yet survivors repeated it, their voices slow, their eyes distant, as though still tasting it in memory. Some told of the confusion it brought. They spoke of standing in line, watching the tubs of frozen white pass down by enemy hands, feeling their minds stumble between disbelief and hunger. They spoke of eating, of savoring, of feeling shame rise even as sweetness filled their mouths. Others recalled refusing at first, unable to reconcile pride with sustenance, then yielding at last, for hunger speaks louder than honor. The detail returned again and again in testimony, a thread woven through memories of fences, barracks, and endless days. It was not the fences that most puzzled their listeners, nor the guards, nor even the routines of captivity. It was the ice cream. Historians, too, paused at this detail. What did it mean, they asked, that the enemy fed their captives not only with necessity, but with luxury? Was it strategy, a way to demonstrate power through abundance? Was it mercy, uncalculated, born of surplus, shared without thought? Or was it something else entirely, something that revealed the ordinary humanity of those who guarded prisoners even while their nation waged war abroad. The ice cream, though simple, became a symbol that resisted simple explanation. Survivors who spoke of it often did so hesitantly, their voices tinged with wonder or disbelief. Some admitted that they had carried the memory in silence for decades, fearing it would sound like betrayal if shared. Others confessed that it haunted them still, for it contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. "We thought we would be beaten, starved, treated worse than animals," one said softly in later years. "Instead, they gave us food. They gave us ice cream. I could not understand it then. I do not fully understand it now." These retellings carried not only the strangeness of the moment, but also the broader truths of war. That propaganda shapes enemies into monsters, that reality often undermines those illusions, and that the smallest acts can reveal the deepest contradictions. To speak of ice cream in captivity was to challenge the absolutes of war, to remind listeners that even in the darkest times, humanity appears in unexpected places, and yet, even as these stories were told, questions lingered. Did kindness in captivity erase cruelty elsewhere? Did sweetness in one place lessen the fire in another? Survivors often left such questions unanswered, allowing silence to carry them forward. For memory is not only what is spoken, it is also what is withheld. In the minds of those who heard these testimonies, images formed. Men in ragged uniforms, weary, ashamed, yet holding bowls of ice cream offered by the enemy. The image unsettled, for it resisted the clean divisions of history. It reminded them that war is not only victory and defeat, but also the quiet moments that refuse to fit into either. The waves of memory carried these stories forward from one generation to another. Children who listened to their fathers or grandfathers speak late in life carried the detail with them, repeating it in whispers, in books, in classrooms. Some wondered aloud what it must have felt like to expect cruelty and receive sweetness instead. Others questioned whether they themselves could have accepted such a gift, or whether pride would have forced them to refuse. The detail stirred reflection, not only on war, but on humanity itself. And so the story of ice cream in captivity spread, small yet persistent, carried by voices, by waves, by books that recorded fragments of testimony. It became part of the larger history, not because it was grand, but because it was fragile, because it revealed how deeply the human spirit can be unsettled by the ordinary when placed against the backdrop of war. The waves broke endlessly against the shore, carrying the sound of memory forward. And in time, the echo of waves was joined by another sound, the clinking of ice in a modern glass, the ordinary noise of abundance in a world that had long since left the war behind, yet still carried its unresolved echoes. The soft clinking of ice in a glass lingered, fragile and unresolved, like memory itself refusing to dissolve. The soft clinking of ice in a glass lingered, fragile and unresolved, like memory itself refusing to dissolve. It was an ordinary sound, the kind one might hear in a household at the end of a long day, or in a cafe where voices rise and fall without urgency. Yet, when set against the silence of history, against the echo of camps and the cries of firebombed cities, the sound became something more. It was the echo of contradictions, of sweetness offered in the midst of suffering, of mercy appearing in the hands of the enemy. The clinking glass became a reminder that war is never only cruelty or only kindness, but both, tangled inseparably, carried forward in memory like ripples that never end. The prisoners who once tasted ice cream in captivity did not forget. Long after the fences were gone, long after they returned to their homes and families, the memory lived quietly within them. It was not always spoken of, but it remained, resurfacing at unexpected times. At a family meal, when a child licked sugar from a spoon. At a festival, when lanterns glowed against the night. At a moment of stillness, when the sound of ice in a cup recalled the clinking of bowls long ago. For them, sweetness and shame could not be separated. To remember ice cream was to remember captivity, and to remember captivity was to remember both survival and the surrender that had made survival possible. And yet, even in its strangeness, the memory carried weight beyond shame. It spoke of humanity revealed in unexpected places, of the fragility of belief when faced with reality, of the power of small gestures to unsettle the deepest convictions. Perhaps this is why the detail endured, not only in the hearts of those who lived it, but in the stories retold by their descendants and recorded by historians. For history often clings to battles and treaties, but the human heart clings to sensations, the taste of sweetness, the shock of cold, the bewilderment of kindness received from hands once hated. The ice cream became a symbol, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary, and because its ordinariness revealed how fragile the boundaries of war truly are. It reminded those who heard of it that propaganda can paint enemies as monsters, yet reality insists on showing them as men. It reminded them that cruelty and compassion can emerge from the same source, that abundance and deprivation can coexist within the same war. And it reminded them that memory itself is shaped not only by what wounds, but also by what surprises. Perhaps the story remains unresolved because life itself is unresolved. Can kindness erase cruelty? Can sweetness balance suffering? Can the act of sharing ice cream in a camp weigh against the act of burning cities from the sky? These questions linger like the taste of sugar on the tongue, like the faint ring left by a cup on wood, like the sound of ice clinking in a glass. They cannot be answered fully, and perhaps they are not meant to be. They exist not as solutions, but as reminders of complexity, of contradiction, of the deep and unyielding humanity that persists even in the midst of war. As the story closes, one imagines the scene fading like a dream at dawn. The camp lies quiet, bowls stacked, spoons resting, the day's routines complete. Prisoners sit in silence, their thoughts drifting to families, to memories, to questions unspoken. A guard passes by, his shadow stretching across the yard, lantern in hand. The night deepens, cicadas drone, and in the barrack, a man recalls the shock of sweetness, the melting of ice on his tongue. He closes his eyes, not in peace, not in despair, but in something between. The dream dissolves, as all dreams do, into morning light. Yet even as it fades, the taste remains, unresolved, unforgotten. The war ends, the world changes, but the memory of ice cream in captivity lingers, fragile as glass, enduring as silence, as though it were not only a detail of history, but a symbol of the contradictions that make us human. And so, listener, the tale closes not with certainty, but with echo. It leaves behind the sound of clinking ice, the taste of sweetness against sorrow, the question of what it means to be both enemy and human at once. It drifts away like smoke into the sky, like waves against the shore, like a dream that fades at dawn but never truly disappears.